Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Elisabeth, the Communications Coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We will probably just answer your questions naturally as we're going along, but anything that's not answered by Sharona, we will get to at the end. I'm not going to be looking at the questions necessarily throughout the event because I want to focus on our guest, but I think that we will probably cover most of the things that people have questions about. Okay, so today we are here to help voters make sense of issue one. We want to be able to answer the questions that we've heard the most from voters about issue one. We want to help voters get the information that they need to cut through the noise and confusion and vote based on their values and the facts and not on misinformation or scare tactics. We at the League see misinformation as one of the biggest threats to voters right now. And every election has elements of mis and disinformation, but when there are issues that speak to voters' values and personal experiences, the intensity often increases the likelihood that voters will have to navigate some dishonest practices. And obviously, abortion is a complicated subject for many, and it can be difficult to get answers that are not clouded by opinion or emotion. And our job at the League of Women Voters of Ohio is to support voters, all voters. And one way that we've always done this is by being a trusted resource for information. We are not here to tell voters what to think. We are here to support voters. We're here to provide resources that empower them to make the choice that best fits with their beliefs. And one way that we do that is to bring experts in to help sort through all of this with us. And with that, I would like to introduce our expert today, Sharona Hoffman. Sharona is the Edgar A. Hahn Professor of Law, a professor of bioethics, and co-director of Law Medicine Center at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. She has been a visiting scholar at NIH and the CDC and clerked for a U.S. Circuit Court judge. And we are thrilled to have her with us today. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Sharona.
My pleasure.
So a little context before we get started. I want to just kind of talk about why we're spending our Saturday morning talking about this. Right now, Ohioans are voting on issue one of two statewide issues in front of voters this fall. Issue one, the right to reproductive freedom with protections for health and safety, would, if passed by Ohio voters, amend the Ohio Constitution to provide legal protection for the right to abortion and other reproductive health care, such as contraception, miscarriage care, fertility care, and the right to maintain pregnancy for Ohioans. Right now, Ohioans have the ability to get an abortion until 22 weeks of pregnancy, but that is temporary. That right is not settled law. And here's why. So even before the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court, Ohio had a law on the books that banned abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. It was passed a few years ago, but legal challenges put it on hold and it was not put into effect. After the Dobbs decision last year, the Ohio Attorney General petitioned to the court to lift the injunction blocking the 6-week ban, which was immediately granted. And so from June of last year until a few months later, when another judge put it on hold, again temporarily, abortion was banned in Ohio after 6 weeks of pregnancy. That hold on the 6-week ban is why today, people can still get an abortion in Ohio until 22 weeks of pregnancy. But temporary is the key word here. The state is fighting to lift the injunction and make that ban settled law. The order that suspended the 6-week ban is currently being appealed. The Ohio Supreme Court has already heard some arguments based on preliminary procedural issues, and they will be most likely asked to rule on the merits pretty soon. And so we don't know, of course, how they will rule, but it is very possible, many would say, likely that they will remove the hold that is currently in place and make the 6-week ban settled law in Ohio. And we'll talk more about why this proposed amendment includes other kind of reproductive health care as we get a little deeper into our program. But this is all to say that the right to abortion is tenuous right now in Ohio. It is pretty shaky. And that's what this amendment addresses. So if passed, Issue 1 would enshrine the right to abortion and other reproductive health care into the Ohio Constitution. It would restore access to abortion to functionally the same way that it was before the Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade. So let us get to why you are all here today, answering the questions that voters have about Issue 1. So here is how this is going to go. I'm going to ask Sharona whether the things that many of us are hearing are true or false. Once she shares her answer, we'll talk about why and what the truth is and isn't in all the ads that we've been seeing and what we've been hearing from supporters and opponents throughout this campaign. So first up, and this is probably the question that we hear the most, if passed, Issue 1 would end parental consent laws around abortion and allow minors to get an abortion without their parents' involvement. Sharona, is that true or false?
That is false. The amendment says nothing about parental laws or parental rights. There is a different law in Ohio that gives parents the right to consent to children's care, to a minor's care. In general, and then there's one specifically for abortions, and those laws would still be in place. Nobody is contemplating that all of a sudden parents would stop being able to direct their children's care.
Okay, and what have other legal folks? So the Attorney General of Ohio, Attorney General Yost, recently issued his legal analysis of Issue 1. What did he have to say about how the amendment addresses parental consent?
I think there is broad agreement that this is not going to eliminate parental consent. A similar amendment was passed in Michigan, and the courts there confirmed that parental consent still stands. Now, there is an exception if a minor petitions the court and explains reasons why they are mature enough and it would not be a good idea to get parental consent. Maybe it's an abusive home or there's some other issue. A judge could say that a minor could make their own decisions about particular forms of medical care. But that is a rare exception. And again, that requires court involvement, judicial involvement.
Right. And if you put yourself in the shoes of that pregnant person who is, 16 or 17, navigating a court system and coming up with the money to pay for an abortion, I mean, those are complicated things. So I would imagine that is not a very common scenario. Is that true?
It's very, very rare.
Yeah, okay. What about the use of the word individual in the amendment? I know that some folks have interpreted that to mean that anyone can have access to abortion if the amendment is passed. Why use the word individual instead of adult?
Individual is a word that is very commonly used in the law. For example, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. The word individual appears all over that. It's just sort of standard text. If you are referring to minors, you would say minor, because that's a very specific thing. Yeah. Individual is just a general word that is not offensive. It avoids being gender specific. And so it's very commonly used in the law. It does not mean minor. Minor would be specifically indicated.
Okay. And what would have to happen to change Ohio's parental consent laws for abortion? Because that, as you're saying, that is not something that would automatically happen if the amendment is passed. The amendment doesn't have anything to say one way or the other about parental consent. So there would have to be action on someone's part. What would that look like? What would the sort of steps be for that law to be changed in Ohio?
When the law is changed, the legislature has to act. And so there would have to be a bill, and the legislature would debate it and decide to change the law. But I can't imagine any legislature broadly permitting minors to direct their own medical care. I mean, do you want 12-year-olds making decisions about whether they should have surgery or cancer treatment or whatever? And so that's simply not going to happen.
And politics does come into that a little bit too. So it's something that you would have to look at a legislature and say, does this seem like a legislature that would pass legislation that would encourage sort of a no holds barred about parental consent generally, and in Ohio in particular?
That is true. Politics always comes into it, but on this issue, I can't imagine any legislature wanting to give minors broad rights to direct their own medical care, because that's simply not in the interest of the minor. The minor would not want to do things because they might hurt or are scary. And you really need adult intervention in the vast majority of cases when you are dealing with a minor.
So to be clear, there is nothing in the amendment that talks about parental consent. So claims that there would be an impact for parental consent if the amendment were passed are false.
That is absolutely false. They've identified the word individual and are sort of building an argument based on that, but it is not a valid argument.
Okay, here's our next one. If passed, abortion would be legal all the way through a pregnancy. People could have an abortion at any time for any reason. True or false?
That too is false, probably. It would be, this amendment would simply say that people have a right to have reproductive care, and then the legislature would have the ability to limit that. Now, they cannot limit it before viability, and viability in this law is dealt with by saying that the doctor is to determine whether the fetus is viable or not. So you can't have a clear-cut cutoff at any particular week. There has to be some discussion with the doctor. In Ohio right now, we have a 22-week cutoff. That is pretty close to viability. I think viability is often said to be 23, 24 weeks nowadays. As technology changes, that might shift. So the law that we have now would have to be tweaked, I think, to allow the doctor to say, no, not yet, the fetus isn't viable, but it would be around 23, 24 weeks if the legislature wants to continue limiting it that way.
And so right now we do have a legal limit of 22 weeks. So the legislature would have to actively repeal that and then not replace it with any limitations. Is that correct? Is that what would have to happen?
If we don't want limitations in Ohio, the legislature would have to repeal the 22-week law. If this amendment passes, I think the existing law that has a very strict 22-week cutoff would have to be tweaked to allow a doctor to say, no, the fetus isn't viable yet, but it wouldn't be a radical change because 22 weeks is close to viability.
And would that tweak come from a legislator introducing that, or how would that tweak come to happen in Ohio?
Ideally, the legislature would fix it on their own. It's possible it will require litigation and a court would tell them to fix it. So there are different pathways.
Okay. And we know that in the United States in the last 50 years that Roe versus Wade was a constitutionally protected law, that very few pregnancies were ended after 21 weeks. I think the statistics are something like less than 1% after 21 weeks. Is there any reason to think that if this amendment were put into place, that would be different?
Absolutely not. Most people, if they choose to have an abortion, we'll do it as quickly as possible. I think the vast majority are done within the first trimester, within the first 12 to 13 weeks, because it's less expensive, less complicated, less painful, fewer days off of work. There is no reason to wait. Now, in some cases, you develop severe medical problems later on. So some abortions do happen later. And again, if there were a severe medical problem after viability, that would still be allowed. But nobody has an incentive to wait, to drag it out, to do an abortion as late as possible. And that's not going to change.
And so, I mean, why would someone have an abortion at 22 weeks? I mean, I think you kind of just said it, but can you say that again? You know, if the rates of pregnancy termination after 21 weeks are in that less than 1%, it sounds like what you're saying is that people who are getting a pregnancy termination at that point are people who, you know, probably wanted to be pregnant, and they're finding out something about the health of the fetus or the health of themselves, how the pregnancy would impact them, and that's what's driving the decision to have a termination at that point. Is that correct?
I think that's the vast majority of the cases. I mean, there may be cases where women didn't know they were pregnant, were sure they were pregnant, were really struggling with the decision, and so it gets delayed. But that is a small minority of cases, because the longer you wait, the more difficult the procedure is.
Okay. The amendment also talks about case by case, and that's been confusing for folks about what that would mean when determining when an abortion could happen after the viability period. Why would that be something that they would include in the amendment, to say case by case?
Right. So first of all, viability is shifting. As we get better technology, babies can survive if they're born earlier. So it actually allows for a shifting of the deadline, you know, so maybe in some years it will be 21 weeks. So you don't want to have a 22-week cutoff necessarily. But also, this just allows a woman to interact with her doctor. The doctor can determine if the fetus is viable, if there are some medical problems with the fetus, it might be viable later on, and you might still want to have an abortion because this is going to be a child who doesn't survive, or who is going to eventually die in the womb, and so on. And so it just allows doctors to be the decision makers. It allows for some flexibility. It allows for shifting as technology improves. It's just a better approach than some kind of clear-cut, you know, random number of weeks.
And the amendment names the treating physician, the patient's treating physician, as the kind of decider. Is that who would typically perform the abortion, or is that a different doctor?
It may be either way. So it may be that you go to your primary care physician and the physician says, you know, yes, you are pregnant, and if you don't want to keep the baby, you have to go somewhere that provides abortion. We don't provide it here. It could be if you're going to the emergency room because there is a medical crisis. It could be whoever's treating you in the emergency room. Some people are economically disadvantaged, do not have primary care physicians, so they will go to Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood will do both, you know, help them with the decision making and then perform the abortion. So there are a wide range of scenarios.
So let's go to our next true or false. So if passed, minors would be able to receive gender-affirming care without parental consent. True or false?
Absolutely false. This is not an amendment about gender-affirming care. It is not listed, and gender-affirming care is not considered reproductive care. It treats different medical problems. And there are states that have bills relating to gender-affirming care that are very specific, that use that language. This is not one of them. This is a different bill that addresses reproductive rights.
Okay, and I think you already talked about this. It would also be related to parental consent, and again, there's nothing in the amendment that addresses parental consent. So some of the claims that we've heard is that if this amendment were to pass, that children would be able to seek out gender-affirming care without parental consent. So it sounds like there are two reasons that this is false. So the first reason is that parental consent is not involved in this amendment, right? And then the second reason is that gender-affirming care isn't typically considered to be part of the, what's under the reproductive health care umbrella. It's a different medical specialty. There are different doctors involved. There are different specialists. So is that the correct way of understanding it?
You are correct. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay. Well, so that one was pretty easy to answer, it sounds like. So that is definitively false. Okay, so our fourth question, our fourth true or false: miscarriage care and contraception is protected. There is no reason to have a constitutional amendment for something that is not an issue. True or false?
That is false, because miscarriage care has actually been a huge problem. You hear in the news repeatedly in states that have strict abortion laws, women who start bleeding, who have a miscarriage, and they cannot get the care that they need because doctors are afraid that they'll be accused of causing the miscarriage, in other words, of inducing the abortion. Doctors are afraid that if there's any fetal tissue that will be removed, they are going to be blamed for having caused the demise of the fetus. The situation, if you have a 6-week ban or a very strict ban, which may well happen in Ohio if we don't have this amendment, is that doctors face a conflict of interest. The doctor is put in the position where they have to weigh the best interest of the patient, who, let's say, had a miscarriage, against their own best interest. Because if there's a record that a patient was pregnant and now she's not pregnant and she went to the doctor in between, some prosecutor might decide to prosecute them. And even if they prevail in the end, they will still have gone through a criminal prosecution. There may be media coverage. It's a terrible thing. And so miscarriage care has been a very big problem for women in states with very strict abortion laws, simply because the doctors have to think about, do I want to take a risk and deal with this miscarriage? And so patients have been sent home without getting a D&C or without getting the treatment that they need. Contraception, there have been legislators in several states that have said, well, now after Dobbs, we are going to try to restrict contraception because certain contraception may be considered to affect a fertilized egg, an IUD or other forms that prevent a fertilized egg from implanting or actually remove it. And so they want to try to prohibit certain forms of contraception.
So when people say that miscarriage care is protected or covered, that's kind of an incomplete statement. That yes, it is, but
it's actually not clear. If you have a 6-week ban and a woman comes to the doctor and she's bleeding, and without the 6-week ban, you would help her terminate the pregnancy, you would do a D&C and so on. It's not clear if, even if she's bleeding heavily, if there's still a fetus in there, it's not clear that you would be permitted to intervene.
So could an abortion ban impact medical care in Ohio in other ways?
There is great concern that people are not going to go into obstetrics or even gynecology, because there's always a risk somebody will come to you with a pregnancy-related problem, and that there'll be certain states where you can get that kind of care and certain states where you can't. And so if there's a big shortage of gynecologists, women will not be able to get their wellness checkups, their pap smears, and so on. It would just be a very unappealing place in which to be in that specialty.
So Ohio would have a harder time getting physicians to practice here.
Correct.
Actually, and so that would lead to fewer care options for everyone. And that addresses a question that we got from one of our guests. So I just want to read this because it's related. How might issue 1 affect the healthcare here in Ohio? Would Ohioans pay more towards their own healthcare?
If you have insurance, I don't think this amendment will affect costs. If she's asking about increases in cost, but it might affect waiting times. It might affect just the kind of care that is available. And another point I want to make is that if you are not permitted to have abortions in a certain state, doctors will not be trained on abortion and on how to perform abortions. And then the few people that come in with a serious medical problem where their life or their health is severely at risk will not be able to get care, because you're not going to have doctors who know what to do, who know how to intervene, because they've not been able to get the training in medical school. Okay. So that is another huge concern. Okay.
So answering the question that we got as far as the amendment passing or failing, potentially impacting the cost of healthcare, it sounds like the potential, if it does not pass, is that it could increase healthcare because there are fewer options, right?
That it would increase costs. I'm not sure about costs. It just might mean that you just can't get the care, or you have a very long waiting period for your care, which is already the case. I have to, just for my annual checkup, I have to schedule it like a year in advance, because she just doesn't have availability.
Yeah.
And so costs, if you are insured, are going to still be governed by your insurance plan, but scarcity is a real risk.
Okay. Okay, let's move on to our 5th true and false. What I see on my ballot for issue 1 is what the amendment would say if passed. True or false?
That is false. What you see on the ballot is a quote summary, which actually is longer than the language of the amendment. The actual amendment is 220 words, I believe, somewhere around there. The summary is longer. The summary, in my opinion, is not a good summary. It has been challenged in litigation because some of the words are not reflective of what it says in this amendment, and they have language about unborn children and so on. So I urge everyone to look at the actual amendment. I believe it's available on the League of Women Voters website, and if you just Google issue 1, I think you could find it as well. But it's quite different. Now, I'm told that the actual amendment will be posted in voting places, so you'll be able to look at that. But please, please be aware that what you read on your ballot is not the language of the amendment.
That's right. And so I just want to give a little sort of backstory about this for folks. So the Ohio Ballot Board is a body that is made up of 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and then it's chaired by the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State is often the deciding vote, right, between how something goes. And so it is often a partisan decision. The job of the Ohio Ballot Board is to write a summary for statewide issues that will be on the ballot, ostensibly because many ballot issues are extremely long and complicated, and a summary is meant to make an issue easier to understand. The other issue that is on the ballot for Ohioans this year, issue 2, is a very long amendment, and so it makes sense in those cases to have some kind of summary to make that sort of more accessible and understandable to voters. But this one, as you say, it just that does not seem to be the case. It is a summary that has actually more words, and that the petition language that people are actually voting on is not what people will see when they go to vote. So it's something that is, it's a controversial thing. It did go to the Ohio Supreme Court. There were some changes made in the ballot language. The people who brought the suit would argue that not enough changes were made. I'm going to put the actual language in the chat in a minute. But that's just something for folks to know when they're going to vote, when they're talking to their friends and families about what this means, is that, when you're voting on a statewide issue, it's important to look at the language of what the amendment would be, not just the language that's going to be on the ballot.
I just saw a question pop up.
Mhm.
Will you be able to read the actual amendment in the voting booth? So no,
No.
not in the voting booth, but every polling place is supposed to have it, taped up somewhere or available somewhere. So you would have to ask the people there, where is the language of issue 1
Mhm.
posted here in this place?
Yeah. And even, a lot of times in polling places, poll workers are very well trained, but sometimes training can be kind of last minute, and some things are prioritized over others. So a poll worker might not know all of the things, and if this is something that hasn't come up a lot in past elections, they just might not know that this is an option. So I think it's important to ask, and I think it's another reason that people should be poll workers, because it's a great way to get information to voters when elections are actually happening. Okay, so here's the next one. I voted for issue 1 in August, or sorry, I voted on issue 1 in August. So I don't need to vote now. True or false?
Oh goodness, the vote in August is confusing for so many people, and I have talked to people who are highly educated, and they are confused about it as well, and I'm very worried about that. Issue 1 in August was a procedural issue. That proposed amendment was to make it harder to amend the Constitution. It was going to require 60% of the vote instead of just a pure majority. It was going to require that if you're even going to get something on the ballot, you would need signatures from all 88 precincts instead of 44. So it was going to make it much harder to change the Constitution to add rights. If you voted no on that, that is why that defeated that procedural proposal to make it harder to amend the Constitution. Now we have the actual substantive issue of, do we or don't we want reproductive rights protection in the Constitution? It's a completely different issue. It's on the merits of reproductive rights. Again, I think there was deliberate causing of confusion because it's also called issue 1, and all the signs I see look like the November 8th issue 1 signs. But what you voted for in August was, do we want to make it harder to change the Constitution? What we're voting on now is, do you want reproductive rights?
Right. And there's some additional confusion because when the August election was happening, we as Ohioans got a lot of attention nationally. And the way that the election was being framed was that it was about abortion, that it was a proxy vote for abortion. And there are definitely arguments to be made that the timing of that election was a result of some legislators wanting to get ahead of the election that we're having now. But the issue itself that people were voting on in August had nothing to do with abortion at all. So there's been some kind of conflating of some of the things that people are weighing, and we just want to be clear that these are very, very different elections. Another thing, so this kind of takes us into our next one. I voted in August. I don't need to vote now. We kind of covered that. So I just want to again be clear, unless you have voted on or after October 11th this year, you still need to vote in this election. So I've heard voters also say, but I voted in August, or I even had somebody say I voted in May, and like, yes, you did vote in May, but this is another election, and it's just really important that we get that out there. So here's our last one. Understanding that these are two different elections, if I voted no in August, I would want to vote no again now. And if I voted yes in August, I would want to vote yes again now. True or false?
Generally false. I mean, it's theoretically possible that you wanted to make it harder to change the Constitution, so you voted no, but you're going to vote differently on the on this issue. But for most people, because it was associated with reproductive rights, if you voted no in August, which meant you did not want to make it harder to change the Constitution, now you may well want to vote yes, because you actually want the added protections for reproductive rights. So as a matter of generalization, people who voted no in August are likely to want to vote yes in November, because that would increase protection for reproductive rights, and vice versa.
And that may not be the case. People may, people vote in all kinds of ways, and we as voters are complicated creatures. But I think the important thing to remember here is that these are just very different amendments that are being considered by voters. And it does not mean the same thing to vote yes now as it did to vote yes in August. It does not mean the same thing to vote no now that it did in August. So it's just important that people know that. And if you are talking to, again, friends or family, that you talk about that, because I think there has been so much confusion. I mean, even just driving in our neighborhood, you see almost literally the exact same signs that were happening in the last election. And it means something very different to vote yes or no in this election than it did in the previous election. Okay, so those were our big questions. We know that was a lot. So I would like to spend our last few minutes kind of answering any questions that we didn't get to address before, or just clarifying anything that folks need. And if we don't get to your questions, or if you have one that you'd rather not ask in front of people, just email me, and I will put my contact info here, and then I'll be sending out slides, and that'll have my contact info in there as well. Okay, so a couple questions. Christina asks, what are the statistics of women getting abortions for their own choice versus a medical reason? For example, someone chose that they might not want the baby anymore versus a doctor might see signs that the woman might be at risk for their own life. I don't know if there are statistics out there and where to look for that information.
I don't know the statistics. I'm not a medical doctor, but I think it's safe to say the vast majority, especially of earlier abortions, are because a person just does not want to be pregnant or has circumstances that make them feel they can't be parents at this time, etc. Medical reasons are more rare. A lot of people can get good prenatal care or can have problems addressed as they develop and retain the pregnancy. But there certainly are cases where, to save the life of the mother, you do need to have an abortion or to protect her health. But that's less common than people having abortions for other reasons.
And
Do you have
so
any statistics, Elisabeth?
yeah, so the CDC, I think 2020 is the most recent year that we have for national statistics, and under 20, or sorry, pregnancies that are terminated past 21 weeks have a less than 1% rate, so it is very few. I don't know why stats are not collected for sort of what weeks the post 21 week means. So when we say, less than 1% of pregnancies are terminated past the 21st week, that could be that 80% of them happen at 22 weeks or not. We just don't know. I'm putting the CDC stats in the chat here for folks to be able
I
to
think
look
the
at that.
question, though, was about reasons for abortion.
Right, and that's not something
Not
that is
available because
included in
that's private,
statistics.
probably.
Yeah, right. How to counter the information out there about issue 1 being about parental rights. Signs encourage, vote no, say protect children. Yeah, I think in general, Carol, misinformation, disinformation is really the scourge of our elections right now. It's really the thing that I think keeps us all up at night, those of us who are voting advocates. I think that the most important thing we can do is use our own voices to talk about what's true and what's not. There are lots of great resources to share. I'm proud that we have created a lot of them. So we can, I'll share what we've got in the chat in a second. Being able to talk about it, and also, these are things that people have, again, I need to tell you, people have very, very strong dug in positions about abortion. This is a very a personal political idea for a lot of us. It's not abstract, it's real for people's lives. And it can be really hard to counter information that does not align with people's personal viewpoints. So I think it's just really important to communicate the truth in as many places as you can. So, for people who've got social media, that's a great place to do it. If you're having conversation with people, and again, I would never want to get into arguments about people or with people. That's not generally how any of us are persuaded by anything, especially if we really don't we don't want to hear it, if it's counter to what we believe. So having calm conversations that you're sharing information and facts is I think the best way to do that. I would love to hear other people's thoughts about how to counter misinformation and disinformation. But I think really the important thing is just to keep putting the truth out there and being just very clear. We're not, this is not a partisan issue. The truth is not partisan. These are facts. And there are lots of reasons that people would want to vote for or against issue 1. What we want at the League is for people to make that decision based on their own interests, based on their own values, based on the facts, and not on scare tactics that are being used to cloud the issues.
I think we got maybe in the chat a comment about, can the League have people that distribute the actual language of the amendment at polling places?
Or any organized group, yeah. I think that's a great idea. I don't know if that would be considered electioneering. Somebody else might have a knowledge about that. I mean, it is literally the amendment. I'm not sure. I think that would be something to ask an elections official. If anybody else has insight into that, we would love to hear it. What other questions can we answer? Yeah, I know, Nancy, it is frustrating to to us as voter advocates that a real, like, what is actually going to be in a constitution, if it's passed or not, is not something that is easily accessible. And even just doing a Google search, so the two sort of official places that the language is located, one is on the Attorney General's site as what petitions have been submitted, and then the other one is in the Secretary of State has released his issues report, which goes through both issue 1 and issue 2. It has the ballot language, it has the amendment language, and then it also has reasons that people would want to vote yes, written by the campaigns for issues 1 and 2, and then reasons that people would want to vote no, written by legislators who oppose issues 1 or 2. So it is not easy to find. What other questions can we answer? Nothing, really? Okay. Clearly, we've answered all the questions. We've solved all the world's problems today, Sharona, so good job. Okay. We're going to send out some slides after the call, and looks like we got one more question. Oh, no, didn't see it. Oh, Suzanne, there, I see you. The Senate recently published a bulletin opposing issue 1. What can be done at the government level to counteract that? So yes, the Ohio legislature did just do that. What can be done at the government level to counteract? I guess I'm not sure what your question is.
You
Suzanne?
just need to vote at this point. There's, we have a conservative legislature and a conservative government, and they're allowed to be opposed to this, but we have to keep providing information and dispelling myths, and then voting and making sure everyone else we know votes as well.
Yeah, and there's some thought that once that language was introduced by the Senate, that kind of empowers legislators to be able to talk about this issue in a way that they were not really able to before. It doesn't have a lot of meaning. It's just sort of a statement by some legislatures that got passed. It doesn't impact any law. So I want to be clear about that one. Where can we get a sign to vote yes for issue 1 or 2? So we are not part of any campaign. I would say for people who want to have a sign saying yes, they should reach out to the yes campaign. And if they would like to have a sign saying no, they should reach out to the no campaign. The name of the just real quick, just the name of the yes campaign is Ohioans United for Reproductive Rights, and the name of the no campaign is Protect Women Ohio. So if you'd like to have a sign either way, you can reach out to them. Sorry, Sharona, please go ahead.
Yeah, also the Democratic Party has yes signs, so you can reach out to the Democratic Party in your area, and they should be able to provide a sign.
And equally, the Republican Party will have no signs for folks who are wanting to have no signs. Dorina asks, I understand that if issue 1 does not pass, there is a representative that has a bill going to committee that will make any abortion murder, and all involved would be prosecuted. Do we know if this is true? I haven't heard that specifically here in Ohio. That doesn't mean it's not true. It just means I haven't heard it. Sharona, have you heard that?
I'm not sure about this particular bill, but I know there are states that are at least contemplating, bans from implantation. So that it would not surprise me if somebody's proposing that for Ohio as well.
Yeah, and there are other states who have used that language in their legislation as well. And I think, we talk so much about national politics in this country. Local politics are so important, and I know that many people feel less comfortable talking about their state legislators and their state representatives, but that's where the decisions are being made about all of these things. So no matter how you feel about abortion or anything, it's really important that we vote in our local elections. So there's a couple more questions that I missed earlier. So why the 5th paragraph in the issue giving the state the power only allow the state? And that's going to mean I have to pull this up, right? So 5th paragraph. Thank you for holding here. Only the state.
I don't see a fifth
I
paragraph.
was gonna say, I don't either.
Is that from the summary maybe? Or
Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm not finding it. My computer's being not super helpful. Well, let's see if we can figure out what that means. So only the state. This is my guess, and I'm not sure exactly what part that you're talking about, Betsy. But in the original language that the ballot board wrote, the language said something along the lines of citizens of the state can limit abortion after 22 weeks, and I'm not 100% sure about this, so people please correct me where I'm wrong. And that was the part that the Ohio Supreme Court changed they issued a ruling saying that should be changed, was that it should be only the state and not the citizens of the state. Sharona, did I get that right at all? I feel like I totally
well,
garbled
I
that.
was actually reading this, so I see something here about the state under B2. Maybe that's the reference, and it says that the state shall not burden reproductive rights unless the state demonstrates that it is using the least restrictive means to advance the individual's health in accordance with widely accepted and evidence-based standards.
Yeah.
So I think that just means that the state, if that is the reference, it means that the state
Suzanne says yes.
Could still regulate abortion, like say that the people providing abortions have to be licensed and there has to be proper equipment and proper standards of care. And although that is somewhat of a burden, that would be legitimate because that is in order to further women's welfare. So, states can still regulate medical practice, and this language is simply saying that we're not trying to undermine the state's ability to regulate quality of care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. What else? Yeah, sounds like that's it. So, Catherine, yes, this recording will be available to share with others. We will include that when we send out the slides, and sometimes it takes a little while for Zoom to kind of process all of it, so it might be a little, and so we might not send these out until tomorrow, but we'll send them out as soon as we've got them. Anybody have anything else before we let you get back to your Saturday? Thank you all so much for being here, and especially thanks to Sharona for making us all smarter today. I think that, all of us have the ability to counter misinformation, that we can take these things back to our communities and to our networks and to our friends and to our family, so that when we are seeing things that are just wrong, that we can point them out. And I think that is something that is really important that we all do. I'm just going to put in the chat before we go. We have on our website a section about the facts on issue 1, and it talks about the ballot language. So it has both the amendment language and the petition language. It has some FAQs about issue 1 and some general information. And I just want to end by saying that, voting is happening now, starting, Monday again, early voting is happening in boards of elections across Ohio. And then election day itself is November 7th. The deadline to request an absentee ballot is October 31st, and that is coming up. So for folks who want to vote by mail, I would strongly urge that you do that today to request your ballot. And I think that's everything. So please reach out to us if you've got questions about any of this or any other voting thoughts or concerns. And thank you so much for being with us today. We hope you have a great rest of your Saturday. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.